One of the things that nobody wants to admit is there is a certain thrill in killing that many guys learn. I've had guys tell me, and it's there's both a missing of the thrill and a shame that it was a thrill. Guys that trust you will sometimes tell you, not only did I kill a lot of people, but I liked it and I miss it. It was exhilarating. And sometimes, I've had guys say, the more personal it was, the more exhilarating. To kill a guy with your bare hands and have their blood on you, there's something just incredible about that. Not that they do that at home, not that they are planning to do it, but it's like a shameful secret that they hold.
Chris, welcome to Discover More.
Thank you, Benoit. It's great to be here. I'm excited.
Likewise. So Chris, why are top tier or tier 1 operators, also maybe people know them as special forces, world-class and elite in all aspects of their lives and performance, including high intelligence and not just the physical paralysis that people might know them as?
The basic question is, what is an operator and who are they and how do they fit into the U.S. Armed Forces? So every branch of the U.S. military has some element of special operations, and operators are the tip of that spear. They are the ones that are the combatants, although they have a whole ecosystem of technicians, intelligence, communications, transportation, supporters around them. So who is an operator? So Navy SEALs, for example. Naval Special Warfare has Navy SEALs. They are the kind of the prototypical operator for the Navy. The Navy also has explosive and EOD technicians. They have SWCC. They have fast boat pilots. So there's multiple operators within some of these contexts. The Army, for example, has Green Berets. They are special forces. They have Rangers. When you use the word tier 1, so operators are elite. They go through a very profound, intense selection and training. From there, some of them, a small percentage of them, get invited to try out for the tier 1 units. So in the Army, for example, you've got the Green Berets as special forces, and then you have like Delta would be one example. SEAL Team 6, which is known as Development Group, is the tier 1 unit for the Navy. Air Force has PJs, combat controllers, Marines have MARSOC.
So from your extensive experience working with either tier 1 operators or just special forces in general, what are some of the ubiquitous qualities have you seen in them? Since, as you said, it's highly selective and only a small subsets of people get invited to try out.
Right. What's interesting is we're not very good at predicting who will be successful once we get 100 soldiers into the selection and training pipeline. And that's usually a 6-month, essentially audition, tryout, if you will. What makes the ones who complete that special or different? And you have to remember only about 8%, 5 to 8% are gonna make it through. So they start with a group of people who are already considered to be ready to be there, and only a few of them make it through. So who are they? Mental toughness is probably the number one. Physical stamina and toughness, and then super high intelligence and an ability to be a problem solver, to think outside the box.
How does risk tolerance or their ability to navigate calculated risk situations come up based on the criteria you listed?
Well, I think, yes, that's really good question. So I think the answer to that is the successful operators have the ability to either inherently or through training, and probably it's a little bit of both, control their physiological responses to danger. So when the shit hits the fan, and most of us are sweating and shaking and ducking for cover, we may actually even see a slowing of their heart rate variability in their heart rate. So in those moments when most of us have an extreme physiological arousal that would make us less effective, things slow down for them.
I think I see some thread lines between tier 1 operators and maybe world-class elite performers like Olympians. I think they also alluded to the exact same phenomena that during the highest of the stress, they're actually the calmest.
Yes.
How does that pan out though? And maybe we'll dive deep into your book, because as you know, life is a mental game, but mindset cannot overcome everything. In this case, physiological toll, the physical toll, hormonal imbalance.
Right.
I think their strength is their mental toughness, like you said. At the same time, their very strength can often be their very weakness itself.
Exactly. That's well said. What we see, what it takes, even just to make it through the selection, is that never quit mindset. No matter what happens, I'm not going to quit. No matter how tired, no matter how exhausted, no matter how much I hurt, I might have a sprained ankle, I might have a broken wrist. I'm not going to quit. And that mindset is what is required for the job. And never out of the fight. And ultimately, it's the idea is you're on a mission and you're not going to give up. You're not going to quit. You're going to keep going no matter what. And that's great. And it means that you're there for your comrades, your left and right, and you're there for your team. But nobody wants to be pulled off the line. So when you're home, when you're training, when you're, in between deployments, nobody wants to raise their hand and say, hey, I'm injured or I'm hurt. So what you get one result of this is guys go 10, 15, 20 years without admitting to the injuries that they may have incurred. And they just push through them and ignore them until oftentimes they can't any longer.
I think 12 steps in AA really drove this message home. But, the first step is accepting that we do have a problem. And as you know, folks like elite performers, high performers, special forces, it's hard for them to seek help because it's hard for them to bypass the first step of accepting that they need help. How does that play out with your clinical practice, working with these very unique and self-selective process of groups?
Well, virtually every operator I've worked with has come to me in one of two ways. One is a referral, a friend of a friend. So most of the referrals that I get are friends of friends, just word of mouth. And over the years, over the past decade, that's brought several hundred operators to me for conversations. They come to me sometimes just curious, like wanting to learn. Sometimes they're desperate. I just shot my tires out on my car in a drunken argument with my wife, and I was in lockup for a week, and I just got out, and I'm desperate. Frequently, here's the most common complaint is something's wrong with me, and I don't know what it is. I can't put my finger on it. And somebody said you might be able to help me.
So different people come to you through different, aspirations and just out of necessity, sounds like?
Yeah. And sometimes it's a spouse pushing them. Hey, we need to make some changes. Sometimes some of my referrals come from a law firm that refers private defense contractors for me. So I'm doing formal forensic evaluations in some cases, but most of them are informal conversations that I'm having with guys that I've just been introduced to, friends of friends.
So when they usually come to you, what are usually your first few steps? Do you first destigmatize some of the mental health, given the, tough mental or mental toughness that these people carry as a chip? Or do you validate their concerns? Since for them to come to you, as you said, they went through loops. I'm sure they went to medical treatment, they went to hospitals, specialists. Maybe they said, hey, it could be somatic. We don't know what's going on. All the tests came back negative. There's no valid concerns. What do you usually do when you do come across these casuals or informal conversations?
So I'm not functioning like a traditional clinical psychologist in these conversations. I think of myself more as a mentor, as a coach. That approach really works. It resonates. And I don't put the focus on mental health per se. I put the focus on performance and behaviors. What do you need to do better or differently in your life? What are the impairments that are holding you back? And then we go from there. Now and then I'll mostly just listen. Tell me about your career. Tell me about what's going on. Are you still active duty? Are you post-service? I need a snapshot of a career early on, like how many years, what kind of deployments, what kind of specialties were you doing? What are some of the key events in your service? From there, it's going to be I have some fairly boilerplate sort of steps that I'm going to review. Have you had a sleep study? Have you had your hormones checked via blood test? That's an early question. Those are kind of low-hanging fruit.
So it's actually, I want to go into the sleep study you talked about. You dedicate entire chapter 3 on the importance of sleep and about half the book overall. So I'm very passionate about sleep. I used to be I guess, growth mindset oriented high achiever who always said, oh, I could minimize my sleep, work on my productivity, because you get addicted to the sustained peak performance, which I've learned to decondition and unwind in my 30s. So why must sleep be a non-negotiable instead of an afterthought, not just for the elites, but for everyone?
For all of us, right? So early on, and I'm going back 10 years now, one of the first hooks that I set for guys has always been sleep, because none of the guys I work with sleep well, even when they have the time to sleep. Chronic tiredness and fatigue, and then the cognitive dulling that goes with that is super common. So that's partly the hook that guys will start to engage with. Oh yeah, I'd love to sleep better. I'll talk to you about that. So why is sleep so important? Well, I mean, we've learned so much about sleep in the last decade. We now know we have a glymphatic system in our brain. When we're asleep, in certain slow wave sleep, that system gets activated. It clears out the toxins in our brain. We're consolidating memories. We're consolidating our experiences and making sense out of things. Sleep is so critical to our performance and our functioning. And for special operations, much of the work is night work, especially on deployments. It's night work, but a lot of the training also is night work. They also put in crazy long days. So sleep deprivation is just inherently baked into training and to deployments. And then you have, of course, if you're traveling around the globe on a regular basis, you've got that jet lag, circadian effect. So virtually all of these guys, what I find is sleep is a major problem. Insomnia is a huge problem, but so is sleep apnea. Almost all the guys, almost every operator with 10 years of service in develops sleep apnea. It's so ubiquitous, I assume it from the beginning of the conversation.
So I want to keep, I guess, beating this drums on the sleep. Can you share maybe a few more compelling statistics or informations, like a quick psychoeducations about the detriments of a biological clock, having a messed up circadian rhythm, having sleep issues? And because I really want to paint a comprehensive picture of, yes, when we sleep, we process the neurotoxins. It's a way for cleaning our mind, so to speak. When you've been driving your cars for a lot of mileage on it, you clean your car if you care. Right. And a lot of us are choosing to skip the cleaning process because
change the oil.
Right.
Yeah. That's probably my analogy is sleep. We're changing our oil, but also with sleep, all of our biological processes, every single one of them is being regulated in our sleep as part of the natural circadian rhythm. So when we're sleeping, that's when our metabolic system is doing certain things. It's when hormones like testosterone are being produced. So sleep deprivation and disrupted sleep is going to reduce testosterone production. So one of the best things you can do, and virtually all the guys I have either have diagnosably low testosterone or they're at the very low end of what medicine calls normal healthy range, but they're being benchmarked against general population, not against their own personal baseline or the baseline of operators. So sleep is critical for metabolic functioning, hormonal functioning, taking care of the nervous system. I'm quite sure that we could do a deep dive and find benefits to every single physiological system in the body are helped by sleep. And so if you're not getting enough sleep, or if your sleep is fragmented, which is another problem, guys wake up 100 times during the night. So you're interrupting the quality of your sleep. So as you know, it's both about quantity and quality. You need those hours of REM and slow wave sleep. We call it restorative sleep. Mm-hmm. And part of the way I frame this to guys is you want to be a high performer, so you train super hard, but you're wasting your training efforts if you're not also putting in the recovery efforts.
It's like working out. Muscle growth doesn't happen when you're breaking your muscle fibers. It grows during your recovery period.
Exactly.
Right.
If you're giving short shrift to your recovery, you're sabotaging yourself.
And I just want to really drive this message home, right? The lack of sleep or sleep disturbance or poor sleep hygiene, using clinical words, it increases your future, or it decreases your future index and increases your future health issues by tenfold in every aspect. Yep. And just a really compelling thing is the fact that UN and the peace treaties and all that bans sleep deprivation as a torturing tactic internationally. That should really portray the importance of sleep. Like sleep deprivation has been outlawed as a torturing tactic against the enemies. Yeah. So imagine the necessity of sleep for human survival.
Right. Now, let's talk about the training. For example, in the training and selection for SEALs, which is called BUDS, Basic Underwater Demolition School, there's a week known as Hell Week. And part of the reason it's called Hell Week is they very intentionally don't allow the SEAL candidates to sleep. They literally push that envelope and they keep them awake for days at a time while they're actively doing training activities, hiking, swimming, diving. And that sleep deprivation is part of how they're being tested. It's essentially a crucible, because if you can't stay awake for 2 or 3 days and be physically active, then you may not be able to make it on certain types of missions that we would put you on. And it's a way of assessing for that mental toughness. Who's going to be tough enough to push through that week? So literally what they do is they push the envelope of sleep deprivation. Then they allow them a few hours of sleep, like pretty close to before they would just die of sleep deprivation. Allow them a few hours of sleep, wake them up, and start that process all over again. So Hell Week is literally a week where that is famous for you're not going to get more than an hour or two of sleep this week. Every other branch has some experiences like that baked into their training and selection process.
I really enjoy Dante's Inferno, his book and poetry, and I feel like sleep deprivation will be the 10th level on Dante's Inferno.
Yeah. One of the things that we know is once you become very sleep deprived, you lose a lot of your hand-eye coordination. So if you're a sniper, oops, there's a problem. My one experience of extreme sleep deprivation, I was having hallucinations after a few days. So, temporary psychosis is even a potential outcome for extreme sleep deprivation.
Let's go into some of the things that your folks come to you with, aside from sleep disturbance. And as you said, it's not just the lowest hanging fruit. It's also the most potent one if you can address it, right? I'm the same with my patients and clients. I address their sleep hygiene first, and then environments, and then their diet, and then whatever their history may be. What is PTSD trap? Since I'm sure many, if not all of your guys have been diagnosed, and women have been diagnosed or been presented with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. What is that? What is a PTSD trap?
The PTSD trap, as I've talked about in my book, and as several of the quotes in my book refer to, I think the PTSD trap we face in America now for all of our veterans, as well as now many civilians, is we're being told, hey, you had a trauma, you have PTSD, which is originally a disorder of fear reactivity, fear response, hyperarousal.
Shell shock.
Well, we can come back to the different names for it. And that's an interesting conversation in and of itself. The problem is PTSD is a disorder that we can treat. We have some very effective treatments for it. But instead, through the US VA system, the Veterans Affairs system, we tell veterans that they're disabled if they have PTSD. And we pay them money while they're sick, we pay them money in the form of monthly disability payments, which can vary based on severity and based on other conditions. But the PTSD trap is when you try to convince the VA that you have PTSD and you get that disability and you pursue that disability and then you don't get better. So I and many others, we have a concern that we've created a nation of psychiatric invalids in our veteran community. Now we can take the next piece of this is I don't think most operators actually have PTSD. Many of them do, but we've changed the PTSD diagnosis so significantly since 1980, it kind of means just about anything. It's depression, anxiety, anger, hypervigilance, and the fear reactivity and avoidance. So we've expanded it to be so inclusive. You can meet the criteria in a variety of different ways. Most of the operators don't have that fear reactivity.
So it's interesting, and we don't have to go into the history of hysteria, shell shock, how it was actually revamped and VA was forced to recognize PTSD because the veterans from Vietnam and their advocacy. I know the history really well. I do want to go into what you just said in passing. The VA, the Veterans Admin Hospital, actually never produced any qualitative and quantifiable metrics to show that, hey, our PTSD treatment is valid, it's effective based on evidence after us pouring billions and billions of dollars in it every single year.
I think it's $13 billion a year on mental health services alone, and then far more than that $13 billion on the disabilities that we're paying out, which have just exploded in the last 20 years, far more so than prior war cohorts. Vietnam, World War II, Korea, et cetera. There are studies, you could go and you could find this clinical trial, that clinical trial showed effectiveness within veteran populations. Some of those studies are done outside of the VA, and I've been a part of some of them. Some of them are done within the VA. Essentially, studies that are done within the VA that show effectiveness are pretty few and far between. But worse, we know that there's a difference between what you see in a clinical trial and what you see just in the general regular functioning of day-to-day clinics. And the VA cannot show any evidence, administrative evidence of efficacy on their treatment programs. So that $13 billion of money going into mental health care programs, we have no evidence that it's helping veterans.
Mm-hmm. Not to harp on the VA too much, but it's relevant in my clinical practice because we often have to fight is a strong word, but for the case in point, we have to fight and argue with the VA psychiatrist because they will just overprescribe whatever our VA patients go with. Hey, we want X, Y, and Z based on a paper we read, and I have these symptoms. No questions asked, they'll prescribe. And then they come back to us and we're saying, why did they prescribe this? You don't have the symptoms. I know you don't have the symptoms. So the vetting process is also very questionable. And so, sure, on the surface, VA was created with a purpose and functionality. And it's an important entity for the many people who are suffering. But I think now we're dealing with this policy divide of the intended reasons why it was passed versus the implementations and the efficacy of what's actually doing for the people.
I think you're right about that. And one of my great concerns as well is the over-medication. When I first started at the VA in 1991 as a trainee, and then I was in the VA until 2006 as a clinician and researcher. When I first started in the early 90s, we had all our cohort of Vietnam veterans at that point. So they were in their mid-40s, generally speaking, as a group. They were all being prescribed Valium. Benzodiazepines, primarily Valium. I had patients that were taking 80 to 100 milligrams a day of Valium, which is pretty much enough to knock an elephant out. What we kind of realize is most patients who were prescribed those doses weren't actually taking those doses because they couldn't have been walking. But we went through a process where there was kind of two groups of psychiatrists that really butt heads with each other at my VA. And there was one group that was prescribing all the benzos and another group that was saying, whoa, this is nuts. You're harming these patients. And eventually we saw a shift where it became accepted that benzodiazepines really weren't the right medication to be prescribing. But fast forward to today, I routinely see guys coming to me, and this is true of all veterans, not operators, 15 medications, 20 medications. I once sat around a table with a group of veterans, and they were just comparing notes, and they went around the table and just said how many medications they had peaked at, 20, 18, 22, and every single one of them talked about how much better they felt when they got off those medications. And so there are really good psychiatrists and neurologists out there where for them, part of their practice is working with a patient and going, okay, you don't need to be on 10 psychiatric medications. Let's sort this out. Let's get it down to 1 or 2. So one piece of advice I give my patients is, psychiatric medications have a place in treatment, potentially. I'm a fan of certain medications. I believe they have an important role. But if you find yourself being prescribed more and more and more, if you get up to 3 or more, take a pause and ask some questions. Is that really the care you need? And it might be. I'm not saying that 3 or 4 medications, on rare occasions might be appropriate, but rare occasions. Yeah, we are over-medicating. And the phrase veterans use is medicate and isolate. That's the VA's treatment. We're going to medicate you and isolate you. So here's a bucket full of pills. Here's your disability. And that's really the treatment it's really what we're providing for you. Go home and come back in 6 months and we'll give you another bucket of pills. Mm-hmm. That's what I hear. I'm not in the VA. So that's kind of what I hear all the time.
Sounds pretty accurate given my current interaction with VA. Also, not to mention the complex interplay of the different psychiatric medications that creates new symptoms, right? New avenue for help. And one more thing I would say about the VA is a lot of veterans do need it. They do have actual proof of diagnosis and proof of disabilities. Of course, housing, addiction treatments, all that, they deserve it. At the same
Absolutely.
time, many of them, at least I'll speak from my clinical experience, a lot of my veteran clients, they always look for the first. And I said, what's the significance of the first? That's when they get their disability and SSDI and VA benefits.
Yeah.
And that's what I
Yeah.
mean by invalidate, using your words, is
Yeah.
their agencies and their empowering presence of who they were are getting diminished and replaced with this new
Yes.
diagnosis. And how can you have incentive to better your life when you feel like as long as there's a first, my life will be okay?
And we know that for humans in general, we need a mission and purpose. We need to have a sense of belonging to some tribe. And that is especially true of high performing individuals who are capable, still capable. So one of the things that I worry less so about in the special operations community, because when they get out of the service, most of them go on to have amazing, service lives, in other ways. They build businesses, they run programs, they do amazing things. But overall, I worry that we've told our large cohort of very capable people in America, we've told them you're an invalid and you don't need to work anymore and you don't need to be productive. You don't need to have a mission. You don't need to fit in somewhere. We're just going to take care of you rather than encourage you to contribute to society.
I want to talk about why our diagnosis isn't our identity, whether that's a PTSD trap we've been talking about or any other diagnosis,
Right.
ADHD,
Right.
anxiety,
Right.
depressions, and
Right.
so on. What are your thoughts on that? Like, why is it important for us to really internalize this, that yes, diagnosis is helpful. It's a label that empowers us to seek help, read
Right.
information, read literature. So we know the monster we're dealing with, air quote, but why can't our diagnosis become our identity, Chris?
Well, I think this is a problem for all of us. This is not a veteran issue. When we give somebody a psychiatric diagnosis, especially at a young age, think of a teenager being diagnosed with depression or a child being diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The intent, the medical intent is to say you have a medical problem and we're going to treat it. Too many of us, and it's become part of our language in society. We take these diagnoses and they become kind of at the center of who we are. One of the things I do in my teaching with undergraduate classes is I try to say we're not going to talk about somebody being a schizophrenic. That's not who they're not. It's not their identity. We're going to refer to them as somebody with schizophrenia, a disorder. If you have cancer, you're not a cancer-ic. You are a person with cancer. If you have a metabolic, if you have diabetes, you're not I guess we do use that word, diabetic, but it's to describe a trait, not the whole, or an issue, not the whole person. So it is challenging. It is tough. What I try to say to everybody is this is not your identity. You're going to get treatment and you're going to put this illness either in the rearview mirror or it's going to become a chronic, issue that you're going to manage. And we all have stuff that we manage. And most of us have 2 or 3 medical problems at any given time, especially as we get older. We don't have to become our illnesses. And so part of what I do with this allostatic load framework, and we should probably talk about kind of what is allostatic load and what are the implications for that perspective. But part of what I try to say to people is the phrase operator syndrome is describing a framework, and that framework allows us to think about the inevitable type of injuries that we're going to see after 8, 10, 12, 20 years of service and special operations. But we can also think of it as a framework for mitigating and managing and helping maintain our health and our wellness and our functioning. So I put a lot of the onus on using words like injuries and impairments and then performance optimization. And that's what I love about my community of special operators is you talk about performance optimization and they're all about it.
Yeah, it's like salesmanship, right? You use what attracts them and what they gravitate towards as like the entry point for seeking help. I do want to talk about homeostasis allostatic load. Let me table that very briefly.
Yeah.
I'm very passionate about our trauma or diagnosis not being our identity because I think being reductionistic for physics has been very helpful with Newtonianism and all things. With humans, however, I think we need to stay away from being reductionistic. Yeah. We are comprised of the sum of our parts, but as you know, what makes humanity beautiful is we're larger than the sum of our parts. I mean, think about art. I was just listening to a podcast about art. It has no inherent utility. Yet so many of us create art. We gravitate towards art, the divinity of art. Mm-hmm. And that in itself is the beauty of art. And our ability to think about the macro, the humanity, also the micro of our individual life. Like, we're not just mammal with the biggest brain. Yes, we are, but we're so much more than that. And I hope that all of us can really accept this and view us more than just a single aspect, because we're larger than some of our parts.
I agree 100%. We have many roles. And what I try to do is help guys and gals identify themselves based on who they want to be and what they're contributing. So that's being a husband, a parent, a firefighter, whatever that next job and service is. But also, how does your faith and your perspective on your give back to community, how are you continuing to serve? And we have to remember, everybody that's in the military volunteered to be there. And then when we talk about special operations, people volunteer for that as well. So nobody who's in the military gets ordered to go become and try out for pararescueman service in the Air Force. Nobody gets ordered to go to BUDS. Nobody gets ordered to do the MARSOC, the Marine Raider training and selection. So, and the people that volunteer to go to these trainings can leave at any moment. They literally have the permission to ring the bell, so to speak, in some cases, literally. You ring the bell, you stack your helmet, and you go, I'm done. And it's no harm, no foul from that point. You just go back to where you had been. Whatever your prior position was, or whatever the next position they're going to give you, you do. So it's not, you don't get penalized, you don't get punished. And that's part of the design of the whole special operations community.
Mm-hmm. It's a perfect segue into like homeostasis or allostatic load. You also talked about firefighters. I want to just briefly set the stage before you answer. I want to make this as applicable to the general public as possible, since none of us are Delta 6 or Scout snipers necessarily. A, what is allostatic load, the way you define it in the book? And B, what are the detriments of having our homeostatic states being off balance, no matter who we are?
Thank you for that setup. So let me lead with this first. The framework that we're talking about is applicable not just to operators. It's applicable in different ways to other soldiers, to other combatants. And by the way, I include combat Marines who saw a lot of urban combat. Clearly, especially guys that have more than 1 or 2 deployments or more than a 4-year enlistment, they meet they have the similar framework of problems. But also responders, first responders, firefighters, law enforcement. There are similarities, I guess, is the way I would say it. So allostatic load. Let me read a very formal definition, and then I'll kind of translate that into what I'm referring to here. So this is a definition from 1993, Ewan and Stellar. Okay, so quote, allostatic load is defined as, quote, it's the strain on the body produced by repeated ups and downs of physiologic response, as well as by the elevated activity of physiologic systems under challenge, and the challenges in metabolism and the impact of wear and tear on a number of organs and tissues, and can predispose the organism to disease. So the part of what this all refers to is that all of our human physiological systems are connected to the others. Our brain, our metabolic system, our endocrine system, our musculoskeletal system, our respiratory system, cardiac system, they're all encased in one package, and they all interface and affect each other. So part of the perspective of what I call, let's take a whole systems approach here, is let's consider everything. So if somebody comes to a therapist and appears to be depressed, too often that's as far as we go. We go, okay, it's depression, here's antidepressant medications, here's therapy. But what if that problem is a brain injury or a sleep apnea problem or hormonal problem? Low testosterone can appear to look like depression. It's not going to be as well helped by an antidepressant as it might be by some other things that more directly target the hormonal system. So the concept of allostatic load is simply saying we need to be mindful of all of these. And of course, for a career in military special operations, it's just a massive dose of cumulative allostatic load on all of the physiological systems. So while we do need to be paying attention to the very acute injuries, like a gunshot wound, we also have to be paying attention to the effects of cumulative allostatic load over the course of years and even decades. And so that's the operator syndrome is really just a framework to help us do that.
I love systems thinking, and I do think everything must be whole system as a former policymaker myself. So let's go into that, Chris. What are some of the common objections you outline in the book or otherwise to developing a whole system approach, such as operator syndrome that you coined with your colleagues with the medical paper, which now turned into a book? Yeah, what are some of the common objections to actually developing this whole system approach, since everything is interconnected, to treating special forces and tier one operators? Because as you said, their circumstances are highly unique that many people can't necessarily relate to.
Yeah. Well, first, before I answer that question, let me set it up a little bit by just kind of listing some of the domains that we think about when we talk about operator syndrome. So first and foremost, traumatic brain injury, which we could have a whole conversation on that, but the shortcut bottom line is we're just now learning how much damage blast exposures cause to the brain. We've not really understood this or even paid attention to it until probably the last decade. So traumatic brain injury, which has all kinds of cascade effects, TBI, sleep disturbance, sleep apnea, endocrine dysfunctions and hormonal dysregularities, chronic pain, joint pain, orthopedic issues, average. I know guys that have had over 20 orthopedic surgeries.
Wow.
I won't say that's the average, but I know guys that have that. The average is probably at least 4. Most operators have had orthopedic injuries, headaches. Then you get the ball of misery of psychological things, depression, anger, addiction, PTSD, just general anxiety is very common, that hyperphysiological arousal. And by the way, we're going to talk, I hope, about some of the physiological treatments that don't involve the psychological, understanding that we have traditionally used. Then you have the impairments on the perceptual systems. So impairments to vision, hearing, balance. TBI can cause vertigo symptoms and disequilibrium. You have the cognitive impairments, and then you have all the ripple effects on marriages and parenting and challenges with emotional and sexual intimacy. Then at some point, there's that transition out of the military. So there's a whole challenge of going from one culture, one job to a very different culture, an unknown career and employment that's a challenge to figure out. Then you have the toxic exposures. So we're seeing cancer rates, respiratory illnesses, of course, all the existential concerns, which I think are more significant than PTSD, what we call PTSD. But the existential concerns have different phrases, different terms, but moral injury, guilt, grief, survivor's guilt. These other guys died and I survived. Why was it me? It should have been me. The loss of tribe, the loss of mission when the career is over. And the worst end state that we see a lot of is suicides. Almost every operator I talk to and know can list 5 to 12 friends who died by suicide. Myself, I don't know anybody personally who's died by suicide, or at least that I know of, but I have conversations with people every day, not every day, but every week. And there's a conversation about somebody who recently died by suicide. And I hear the names. Oh, did you hear who died this week? So there's a real sense of urgency here on the suicide front in this community specifically. Okay, so what are the objections? Well, probably the number one objection is that the status quo. The status quo of modern medicine is we, as doctors and therapists, we stay in our lane. So you as a psychologist, you treat PTSD, you don't think about the other things. You treat PTSD, anger, and addiction, and you do that from a psychological perspective. We fragmented all of our medical and mental health care it's true for all of us. But when you have these complex injuries, like I just described, and they're all interrelated, that's another piece. We can't think about your sleep without also thinking about your TBI. We can't think about your what looks like depression without thinking about your hormones and your sleep and your metabolism, et cetera, et cetera. Medicine isn't doing that. Modern medicine doesn't do it that way. Modern medicine takes one disease, one disorder at a time, and there's usually an algorithmic treatment for it. You walk in, you see and it's based on discipline. So if you went to a neurologist with a set of symptoms, you might get a very different treatment than if you went to a psychiatrist with those same symptoms. But the triaging that happens in mental health care, happens in primary care, typically routes people who seem to have psychological problems into mental health. So essentially what this perspective suggests is we need to upend our current fragmented approach to care. We need to rather than having specialists working in silos in their lanes, we need to have more integration and think about the bigger picture for each individual operator or responder.
Do you foresee, based on your lines of advocacy work, speaking engagements, panelists, appearances, and so on, what do you think is going to be the ongoing barrier for the status quo to stop this or resist this from happening? Of course, there's financial. Of course, there's a political messaging. Of course, there's gardening support. Sure. But what are some of the barriers you see as an advocate regarding developing a new whole system approach that caters to these specific subsets of populations who have, like you said, extensively complex needs?
Well, you have the Department of Defense, you have the VA, and you have, private medicine. And they all function in similar ways, and they're all led by people who've been around for decades and been doing things a certain way. I mean, I think we can see and agree on that. So there is a status quo. And if you've been a leader in research on mental health care for 10 or 20 years, and somebody comes along and says there's a very different way in which we should be doing this, and by the way, it may not involve your specialty in quite the same way. It may mean bringing in other specialties. There's a lot of resistance to that. What I have seen is that psychiatrists and neurologists have opinions of the other discipline that aren't always conducive to good collaboration, and they do some things very differently from each other. I think what we're talking about here is a point where we need to make some changes. The people who make the decisions, the policymakers, the politicians, the generals and admirals, the leaders in both healthcare systems and programs, and leaders in medical clinical science, there is kind of there's a way the game is to be played. And the way the game is being played is not optimized for specialized populations right now. And I'll be quite frank, when we published our paper, our operator syndrome paper in 2020, and we published it in a peer-reviewed medical journal, I didn't really have an idea of what kind of effect it would have. I mean, you're a scientist, typically we publish a paper and it goes into a journal and then maybe somebody reads it and it gets cited a few times that year and it maybe gets cited a few times the next year by other scientists. You don't really expect your work to be picked up by the people that you're actually writing about or studying. But in 2020, our paper essentially went viral within the community of operators. In the first 2 months, I probably got 400 emails from operators. Now, part of that is that's my community. At the time, I had a large LinkedIn, community, and it was 90% operators and spouses at that time. So when I posted something on LinkedIn, it went straight out to them. So what I am seeing and experiencing on a regular basis is there's almost a grassroots phenomena that's now happening. It's the operators, it's the SEALs, it's the Green Berets that are going north of them on the hierarchy of the establishment structure saying, wait a minute, I don't want to get treated by your program for PTSD the way you've been doing it. I want to have an attention to operator syndrome. I had a question the other day that came from one of the large treatment programs for operators. It's the Mass General program, the Harvard program. One of their care intake coordinators said to me that now about 10 to 20% of the people coming into their program say, I have operator syndrome and I want to be treated for operator syndrome. So this is a framework, a way of communicating and talking about that's actually out there at the grassroots level. And it's a little bit flummoxing, I think, to some of these programs because they're not quite sure what to do with it. And so what I'm saying to them is, that's great. You tell those operators that, yes, you have this program. You're going to treat and address each of these things. And if you're not, then you better start finding a way to do that.
Mm-hmm. I feel like in a spiritual level, which I am, I think having your operator syndrome paper going viral within the special force community and the emails and the inquiries and the follow-ups, it's almost like a cosmic affirmation that, hey, Chris, you're on the right path. Since, as you know, academia and scientist community is also very corrupted and muddy. And a lot of people, they post with the anticipation and expectations are getting picked up by specific niche medical paper, and or sometimes a lot of times selling their information and metadata to like pharmaceutical interest, which ties into funding and grants and a lot of the behind the scenes nature. So I personally appreciate, I'm sure many do share this sentiment, that you posted something without those expectations, with a pure mission about educating the public, since I think education is the only way for liberation.
Right. And I wrote the book, Operator Syndrome. I wrote the book not as an academic book. I wrote it to be read by operators, by responders, by their families. So it's intended to be a very relatable, easy to read, practical guide, just to help people understand and figure out the solutions that will make sense for them. And one of the things, as you noticed in the book, I'm sure, is while I wrote the book, and I'll take responsibility for everything in the book, throughout the book, every chapter leads off with direct quotes from operators, from spouses, from other scientists and care providers in the community about some of the treatments and solutions that we're seeing effective. So it's really intended to be a book. Again, it's not an academic book. It's not filled with references and citations. I wrote each chapter kind of thinking of each chapter being like a short magazine article on a topic.
I viewed it as like a survival handbook. You give a layman terms explanations, you give them guidelines, and then you also give them additional resources at the end. So it's almost literally like a catered pocketbook for operators who want to better their life and health.
Yeah. And it's also pretty thin, so people can read it pretty quickly if they want to. But you can also, like, let's say your biggest problem or your most prominent concern is addiction. Well, you can go straight to that chapter. You don't have to read the whole book. You could do it chapter by chapter based on your specific needs at the moment or your priorities at the moment.
I echo that. I did a deep dive, as you know, and you don't have to read it chronologically. But speaking of your chapters, I want to talk about what I think is two of the most important topics. It will be anger and existential concerns that you highlighted on chapter 18. We call that existential distress, right, in the clinical world. But going back to anger, why is your chapter on anger, Chris, even more relevant today in 2024?
Okay. Yeah. Wow. We live in an angry world, don't we? So anger is really important to this community, I think, because it's an emotion that is comfortable for operators. More so than other emotions. And what I try to help guys understand is that anxiety, general anxiety itself, which ramps up your physiological arousal, makes you more vulnerable to tipping past some threshold where it's going to manifest in anger. So it's when we're already anxious, when we're already, just kind of ball of tension, and then something happens, we're more likely to be impatient. We're more likely to snap. We're more likely to pitch a tantrum in that moment. But you also have a community. I mean, part of it is this is a community that works with violence. Violence is one of the primary tools that they have. So they're good at violence. And that doesn't mean that they're angry when they're out on direct action missions, but there is a certain level of determination and ruthlessness in those moments. And then at home, anger is kind of is often a very close friend, almost like a shadow. One of the cool things that we've seen in recent years is when you use a treatment like stellate ganglion block therapy, which is a very physiological treatment. It's not done by mental health practitioners. It's done by neurologists and anesthesiologists. It involves injecting a little medication into the sympathetic nervous system. It's quick, it's safe, it's a treatment we've had for 100 years. And what it does is it brings that physiological arousal just down, that baseline arousal just down. And it does it pretty much immediately, like within the first 12 hours or so of receiving the treatment. And when we do that, what we see are guys start sleeping better. They become less impatient and perceived by their families as being more relaxed, nicer, less irritable, angry, miserable. And of course, as they start sleeping better, that leads to a cascade of all kinds of positive benefits and outcomes. So anger is something that's very present, and it's baked into the physiological responses that they have and that they've learned over the years. And it causes so many problems with work and family, potentially, for many. for many guys.
I just want to share one more information on anger is a lot of my clients and even just people in real life, they're like, I don't know how I did that. I can't believe I did that when I was mad, like crime of passions, which are both in forensic world. 99% of crimes of passions are not premeditated. That's why they never get homicide, right? Because it's a moment. It's a spur of knee-jerk reaction based on their arousal and their reactivity. A lot of people say, I can't believe I did that. In response, I say, of course not. When your amygdala, your fear center gets activated, parasympathetic switch to sympathetic, your logic and your neocortex and the thinking brain is the first one that goes offline. So by design, you cannot be logical and thinking when you're feeling angry and emotionally reactive.
Right. Now add the inhibition of alcohol. Half a bottle of Jack Daniels, and now you have a perfect storm brewing. I'll go back to your example. I'll go back to one of the examples I used earlier. Met a guy, actually right after he got released from jail, and what he had done was he'd been drinking heavily, a lot of angry conflict with his wife in front of his teenage daughter. And when she said, "I'm leaving and I'm taking our daughter with us," he went and in front of both of them, shot out the tires of the vehicle, and the police get called, and he's drunk and he's put in the lockup. Fast forward today, by the way, good news is he's sober and he's still with his family, and things are going well. But yeah, you put all these things together and it causes just incredible disruption in life. And I think also a lot of suicides occur when people are just, so angry they don't know what to do. That's the point where people who are alive, guys who are alive, will say, yeah, I had the Glock in my mouth in that moment. And for some reason, I didn't pull the trigger. By the grace of God, go I. But some people do pull that trigger. And those angry moments seem to be one of those times when people are at really high risk.
Also, I think anger is very relevant because we live in this dichotomy of good and bad emotions, which is a very oversimplified descriptions of what emotions are. Since, as you know, all emotions serve a purpose. Like truly every emotion has its functionality, even depression, even apathy, right? They all do. And I think anger is a specifically delicate one because it's very palpable, it's visible. A lot of news are predicated on anger. I personally, in my clinical practice, I normalize anger and anxiety. Anxiety is not a disease. It's a sustained hyperarousal state based on history, circumstances. And I also don't demonize anger. I said anger helps you survive. It's a state. Right? You're able to conjure up more energies, you're physiologically more aroused, you're more capable in certain aspects of your physiology. Yeah. So the question is, how can we eradicate and erase anger? It's not possible. The question is, how can we better manage and coexist with anger in a nonviolent way for our sake, but also the family's sake?
That's exactly what we're trying to do. And let's add hypervigilance to this. Hypervigilance also is a survival mechanism. I mean, for people that were going in and out and spending a lot of time in war zones, hypervigilance was absolutely a survival mechanism. And so you come home and it's still a survival mechanism up to a point. I don't tell anybody America's safe. You don't need to pay attention to your surroundings. I don't tell that to anybody. That's not what I want. But it's like, let's find a reasonable balance of that behavioral adaptation that kept you alive overseas. Here, we don't really have IEDs. So when you're driving down the highway, if you see a McDonald's wrapper, debris in the highway, you don't need to swerve around it, probably. On Route Irish, out of Baghdad, yeah, you probably did. It could have been a roadside bomb. You probably don't need to get up and check your house in the middle of the night every time you hear a dog bark or a noise. Maybe there are times, but if you have your own dog, if you have your own house alarm, if you're in a house with other people, before you go to bed, you lock things up, you button it down, and then you should be able to relax and sleep at night. And so part of it is finding those, helping guys kind of learn to balance those behaviors that are based on years of survival need for those behaviors and reactions, but trying to kind of limit the reflexive response on that at all times. And of course, again, to go back to, if your hormones are dialed in, if you've had the stellate ganglion block, if you're eating right, if you're sleeping right, if you're doing many other things, it's just going to be easier. It's going to be easier to manage those physiological responses.
We need to avoid McDonald's for a different reason, not for the suspicions.
For all kinds of reasons. Yeah.
Right. But IED is probably not one of them. Let's go into cognitive science, which I personally love. And you alluded to this in what you just said. Why can't we always trust our perceptions or sensory input, Chris?
Man, this is a whole conversation right here. We could be speaking to all of America here. Our feelings aren't necessarily evidence of reality. And so our feelings are clues, we can go back to some of the early feelings about some of the early theories of emotion, not early, but theories of emotion, the Schachter-Singer, James Lange theories. Our physiological state gives us some clue about how we're feeling. And then we put a cognitive appraisal on top of that. So if you and I have just run 5 miles, and we're sweating and we're huffing and puffing and our heart rate is up, we know cognitively that's a normal response because we just jogged 5 miles. So we're not anxious, we're not upset by it. But without that, a cognitive appraisal, that same physiological response, if it just suddenly happened to me right now, if I suddenly broke out in a sweat and my heart rate spiked and my blood pressure and everything went up, I would be like, what the heck? There's no explanation for it. It must be something terrible is happening or is about to happen. We call that, it might be a panic attack. It might be a lesser anxiety attack. So part of what operators learn to do in their training, by the way, is to control the physiological response so that they can process things with more cognitive clarity. But of course, that becomes more and more difficult with the TBI, with the brain injury. Cognitive functioning is impaired, and sleep dysfunction impairs our cognitive functioning. Alcohol and drugs impair our cognitive functioning. Chronic pain impairs our cognitive functioning. So it's not that we don't want to make decisions that incorporate our emotions, because actually people who don't have emotions make very bad decisions. We know this from some of the individual case studies of people who have had like brain damage to their amygdala. They're like Spock on Star Trek. They only use logic because they don't have feelings, but they make terrible decisions.
Hypomania.
Without some of the emotional cues that we use. I think part of the problem with operators is they've learned to compartmentalize their feelings. So you go on a mission, your guy next to you is killed, you feel terrible, but you bring him back and you load up and you go out on the next mission. You don't have time to grieve. You don't take time to grieve or to process those feelings that are going there. And so part of what you see is people get to like a point in their career where maybe they're no longer deploying or they're separating from the military. Now, for the first time, there's a little space and time to reflect back. And so what I see for many guys, and this is part of the existential, is that grief and that emotional processing just gets pushed to the wayside while somebody's career is active. And then when they retire or have space, then it can come back in a way that's really powerful and confusing because they aren't used to working and thinking and processing at that level. I'm not sure if I answered your question, Benoit, so please.
No, I did. No, your first sentence, right? Feelings aren't facts. And a lot of our feelings are just distorted perceptions of using your words cognitive appraisal. Very quickly, I know what that means, but what is cognitive appraisal and how is it a very useful functions in our day-to-day life?
Simple example right out of one of the textbooks I use. You're hiking through the desert in Arizona, backpack and your water and your boots and everything. And you come upon you hear a rattle and you see a snake, and it's a rattlesnake, and rattlesnakes are poisonous. And it's like 3 feet away from you on the trail. Your adrenaline immediately kicks in. Your fight or flight, boom, your heart's racing, you're breathing heavily. Your cognitive appraisal is, holy cow, that's a snake, a poisonous snake, it could kill me. So this physiological arousal must therefore be fear. And it must be extreme fear because it's extreme arousal, hyperarousal. So that's the cognitive appraisal it's the snake causing this physiological arousal. And now I better take action. I better run the other direction or grab a stick or carefully, walk backwards, whatever I'm going to do. I need to get away from this snake.
And we won't go dive deep into this because just cognitive science, appraisal, reappraisal can be an episode of itself. Just a quick ad note, most people's, if you don't have some sort of a deeply cultivated practices and heightened self-awareness, most cognitive appraisal happens in a millisecond.
Yes.
Because our brains are hyper primed and evolutionized over 3 million years old, give or take. What that means is when we're praising, air quote, the circumstances, it's not an objective snapshot. It's interpretations of what we think is happening.
Yes,
exactly.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah. And that's, all of our sensation and perception is our eyes take in data, light, and then it sends it back to be processed. So the perception is actually the processing of the raw data, essentially. And it's influenced by our conditioning and our learning and our prior experiences. And so our perception of a situation isn't necessarily reality at all. And in fact, just at a very basic physiological level, our eyes and our ears and all of our sensory organs don't sense the full spectrum. So we work with a very particular part of the light spectrum. We don't see things on the whole full spectrum. So we can't, just by definition there, we can't actually be seeing true reality ever, or hearing it, or feeling it.
I think two effective examples to drive the message home is like normacy bias. Until you drive a Prius that's red, I bet you never notice a red Prius. But once you get it, that's all you see every corner. And the second thing is, like you said, whatever we perceive, it's always fragmented and it's not always a large picture. So I think it's a credence to encourage us to be more mindful, and I guess not always necessarily viewing everything we feel as facts or factual, and create some space in between, which some people do have the opportunity to, some people don't. But speaking of, I think, perceptions, speaking of sensory, speaking of what we view this world as, I do want to go into what I think is the most thought-provoking chapter from your book, your chapter 18. Your chapter 18 on existential concerns was, wow. I had to reread a couple of the parts because these are things I think a lot about, not just as a veteran, but just my psychological hardware, who I am. I do want to go into a very specific little talked about topic that you mentioned in the book. I would love to talk about the thrill of killing and whether many of the special forces you've worked with either display sociopathic characteristics that allow them to commit such acts, righteously or otherwise. And I'm using sociopathic here on a clinical terms, right? As you know what that is, it's antisocial tendencies, decreased, I guess, perceptions of remorse, empathy, and so on. But I would like to talk about the thrill of killing. I think that's something that everyone knows that the special forces do, but it's more implicit and no one really talks about it.
I don't see operators as sociopaths. I don't see them that way at all. Is that to say there aren't some of the dark triad traits that are common? Sure, there are. But when your job is killing and you're trained to kill, you're socialized to kill, and killing is not just your job, and it's not just a point of survival for surviving that encounter in the moment, but it's also about your team. It's also about the people around you. If I don't kill that guy over there, you might kill one of my guys over here. And then you have a habituation to killing, and you have a thrill of killing. And so this is something that we don't talk about in polite society. We don't talk about in America. Soldiers across generations have fought and killed in different ways. We now kill people, traditional, armies marching across fields at each other. You had, maybe cannon in the back, firing cannonball, firing artillery, and killing people at a great distance. You have rifles and lines of people with muskets or machine guns firing across a field, killing at somewhat of a distance. Nowadays, we have drone operators who are sitting in very safe, sheltered bunkers in, wherever, in the U.S., Wyoming, Montana, Texas, wherever they are, playing video games, but killing people on the other side of the world, via drones and unmanned things. So we've changed killing quite a bit. But one of the other realities of special operations is operators are usually not killing at a great distance. They're usually up close. So, urban combat, you go into a house as a team and you clear the house, and you have to make split-second decisions of anybody you see. Are they an enemy combatant? Are they a hostage? Are they a civilian? Do I shoot or do I hold my fire? This is a very complex puzzle. Literally, it's like doing a complex puzzle. The flow of how you move through rooms, who takes which corner and which vector, This takes a lot of cognitive flexibility and problem solving, and it takes a lot of training, this kind of combat. One thing people don't understand about special operations is the sheer amount of deployment time overseas, the operational tempo. During hot periods of the war, you had platoons and units that were going out on missions every night, like nightly. And sometimes going out, hitting a target, coming back, processing the intel, and having that as a lead to run out and do another mission that same night. I don't ever ask people how many men have you killed? But I do know that in many cases, it's literally in the hundreds for an individual. And much of that was done was up close in a room or on a compound, using a rifle or a hatchet or a knife or a lead pipe. So one of the things that nobody wants to admit is there is a certain thrill in killing that many guys learned. I've had guys tell me, and it's there's both a missing of the thrill and a shame that it was a thrill. Guys that trust you will sometimes tell you, not only did I kill a lot of people, but I liked it and I miss it. It was exhilarating. And sometimes, I've had guys say, the more personal it was, the more exhilarating. To kill a guy with your bare hands and have their blood on you, there's something just incredible about that. Not that they do that at home, not that they are planning to do it, but it's like a shameful secret that they hold. I want to go to a Hemingway quote from my book, if I may. And this is from 1936 short story Hemingway wrote titled On the Blue Water. And Hemingway wrote, quote, "There is no hunting like the hunting of a man. And those who have hunted armed men long enough and liked it never care for anything else thereafter." That is a beautiful representation of a secret reality that only operators and a small number of people have awareness of.
I had a former CIA spy, covert operator, Andrew Bustamante, and he also talked about the thrill. But he attributed to his hardware psychologically that allowed him to immune from losing sleep over it, like dismembering of the cells in these violent ways that public can't even perceive as. You said something in passing. You said learned thrill. Are you saying that these are their natural temperament that God cultivated and heightened, or are these learned behaviors?
I think the thrill becomes learned. And I think one is you do it and you're like, wow, once you've had your first kill, your second kill, there comes a point where, most people will say the first kill is very impactful. The second one, less so. We know about the process of habituation. We habituate to things that are scary. We habituate. You spend enough time hanging around spiders and snakes, after a while, they become less scary to you. They affect you less. And killing becomes very natural and even routine for many people, many operators. And that actually gives them a huge edge in combat. They're not anxious. They're prepared. Everything slows down for them in that moment. Whereas for the opponent that doesn't have that habituation is going to be far more physiologically aroused. I'll give a very striking example of this that a guy, one of my early conversations, shared with me. He was saying, when we walked on target, we were calm, we were cool, we were comfortable, we were not aroused. We had the best intel. We knew more than the other guys did. We had the best weapons. We had the best training. And that meant not only with our individual weapons, but also as a team, as a group. So we functioned, seamlessly. And you see this in the movies, a team of operators, 6 or 7 of them go into a house in a row. So there's that stack of operators, and one peels left, one peels in behind him, the other peels right. And somehow they just flow seamlessly. It's like synchronized swimming in the Olympics. That takes a lot of practice. But it's also why our soldiers have so much confidence when they're in those situations. So here's the anecdote I was going to share. He's standing on the side of a door, teammate on the other side of the door of a room or a compound. Somebody inside the room, one of their high value targets, is shooting a machine gun, some kind of belt fed, through the doorway. And they're on either side of the door, just standing there waiting for that belt to run out. So they're just calmly, they're even making little jokes to each other and hand signals. One of them signals, "Hey, do you have some dip?" some smokeless tobacco. So the other guy gets his tobacco out. He throws it in an arc over the door. The guy catches it, puts some in his lip, closes it back up, arcs it back over the door, and they're just smiling at each other, waiting patiently and calmly. And when the gun from the inside, stops firing, they then go and do what they need to do. That type of advantage, and they recognize it as an advantage, is an incredible physiological advantage in moments of extreme danger and unpredictability.
Yeah, that reminds me of a quote I heard where true men, and you can replace that man with people, but true men are not the ones who are afraid of being a beast or a monster, but the ones who can contain and tame the beast within. And I think thrill of killing is a fascinating topic, not just because we're in forensic world, but as you said, it's a highly taboo topic. No one talks about it, even in the movies and portrayal. Sure, there's action scenes and quick exchange, but it's very siloed and not talked about. But I wanted to try my best portray the most accurate and multi-dimensional realities of these tier 1 and just military special operators. And I think thrill of killing, it might be a philosophical thing we're not going to go into today, but part of my thought process was I wonder if it's a reawakening of the repressed desires we all have within through the civilization process. Yeah. Of course, the answer is nature and nurture always. But I personally found the sections in your book about the thrill of killing, the shame, the guilt, the reconciliations of the civilized reality from their battled reality. I find those issues very relevant to your demographic, but also I think it's an important thing for us to really chew on and think about.
And then you come home with that experience, and then you're sitting at the breakfast table with your young children and your wife, and you've got all of this in you somewhere. And how do you then sit there and say, oh, we'll have a picnic today and that will be fun and meaningful? Mm-hmm. And how do you talk to your family about these things? How do you talk to your neighbors? You don't. You just simply don't. And no operator wants their family to have the images in their head of what they've seen and experienced. And it's not the same thing as we have in the movies very often. Movies, typically are slow motion action scenes with patriotic, inspirational music. That is not the reality. And some of the things that guys describe, and I won't get too graphic here, but walking into a building and seeing local civilians who have been tortured and murdered and are nailed on the wall, for example. There are things that are so horrific that we don't even really know about them in polite American society. And when you've seen those things, when you have that understanding that humans are capable of these incredibly grotesque, violent things, most of us can't even really process that. We live in a relatively very safe world here in the West. We can't even imagine some of the things that bad guys do. I mean, and we kind of know it happens, and we have serial killers, and we have horrible things in our society. But for the most part, we don't really process those kinds of experiences or realities very well.
I want to share a quote from the book to sort of drive this message home. And we're not going to go into it, but I just want to really highlight the detriments about mainstream media portrayal. All these, of course, as they should, mass shootings, all these atrocities and tragedies. And it's two-sided, right? Where you need exposures and awareness. At the same time, overexposure, we become desensitized to the sadness and the tragedy of death. In your book, you talked about this quote, in quotes, "If death becomes mundane, how does one maintain empathy beyond that point?" End quote. Yeah. That's the quote I want to close this loop with, is not just the thrill of killing, not just the true grotesque nature that humans are capable of doing this. Since we were barbaric not that long ago, like people forget how brief our civilized society is. But I think the real call to action is, how can we maintain our empathy? How can we not lose empathy and get too desensitized to the tragedy of death, because death is end all be all, whether it's killing or on the recipient side. Before I roll the red carpet for you, Chris, I wanted to end today's conversation on a little bit of a personal note, but also tying that into the veteran communities, talking about the loneliness that you just talked about, the loneliness for veterans to carry the burden by themselves. because they don't want to burden or shift that burden onto their loved ones. You talked about in your book, your great-grandfather, who served in the military under Teddy Roosevelt, was willing to share his stories, which actually in turn inspired you and planted the seed maybe for your career to come. From my knowledge, many Vietnam War and older generation veterans often carry the burden of their stories alone without sharing. And in turn, it actually creates ripple in their relationships. They get distant and far removed from their spouses, from their children, grown children. The spouses and families, they want to support their war veterans, family members, but they can't because they wouldn't open up. They wouldn't share. They'll rather die with their secrets, literally in many cases. So my question is, why do you think your great-grandfather was willing to share his burden by opening up to you guys, which in turn inspired you? But also, why is it important for us to express these air quote secrets so we're not suffering by ourselves?
So when I was a child, my great-grandfather lived to be almost 100 years old. I was 14 when he died, so I knew him very well. And he had lied about his age 16, joined the Michigan militia and fought in Cuba in the Spanish-American War in 1898. He had fought at the Battle of San Juan Hill, and that was a short war. Most Americans no longer even know the history of this war, but it was a 3-month war, relatively low, very low casualties by modern war standards, or even war standards of that time. But most of the soldiers came home with mosquito-borne illnesses from being in the tropics. And they were all brought home. They were dumped at a hastily built camp, Camp Willock, up on Montauk Point, up at the top of Long Island. And they pitched a bunch of tents, and they had this great big field that became muddy and disgusting. And so all these sick soldiers packed into this camp with the idea of, you get better here and then we'll send you home. Well, my great-grandfather, so part of his story is about the war, but part of his story, and maybe even the most important part of his story, is how he was taken care of when he got home. And so it was a independent civilian effort, which we don't see very often anymore in America, but it was, and I haven't been able to figure out historically if this was part of a larger movement, but there was a woman, Mrs. Jack R. Bean, who came up with her butler and her carriage and found my great-grandfather and a handful of other very, very sick soldiers and brought them home with her to her home in New York City. And she nursed them back to health there. And through the end of his life, my great-grandfather always credited her with his survival. He thinks she saved his life and the lives of these other men. And so part of what I grew up with from him was war, the horror of war, but also, an awareness of the after effects and the awareness of how we take care of our veterans matters. My father also was a Vietnam veteran. He's not a combatant. My great-grandfather was a combatant. My father was a physician in the Air Force, spent a year in Vietnam, came home. He never really talked much about his service. He spoke very negatively of war in general terms, but he didn't say much about what he saw and experienced. Probably the best representation of how he responded was he took, in the 1970s, mid-70s, he took our family into the Quaker community. So I went to Sunday Quaker meetings throughout most of my pre-adolescence and adolescence. And one of the philosophical points of the Quaker approach to Christianity is conscience ejector status. So if you're a Quaker, it's expected that you will not participate as a combatant in war. You might be a healer, you might be a supporter, you might be a chaplain, but you're not going to be a combatant. The government actually allows for that status. If you're a Quaker, you get a pass on becoming a combatant. So as a young man, when I turned 18, I had to make a decision about whether or not to register for the draft. We didn't have an active draft at the time, but you had to register for it. I could have had an out. I could have used that as an out, and I didn't. I did register. But so those were formative experiences for me. And so I went to graduate school wanting to work with veterans. Still very naive about it, but wanting to work with and help veterans with the post-war recovery and quality of life.
I think I appreciate that story. And also what I want to highlight is And it's sad, right? Again, the intention behind many veterans who are returning home after very difficult and dark realities are conscientiously choosing not to share. Like I said, to avoid shifting the burden onto their family and loved ones. At the same time, through your story, I think your great-grandfather beautifully demonstrated that there are two sides to war: the horrors, but also the beauty of the humanity, the care, the aftercare, the considerations for strangers, the audacity and the courage for a woman to bring stranger men home at the comfort of her privacy, comfort of her own home, to nurture them back to life. It's not just touching, but I would just want to, this is my best effort to portray that everything that we see in society, good or bad, air quote, even though it's a pro framework, has multiple different sides. And I wish and I would hope that a lot more veterans are willing to share some of their stories based on their comfort and decision making, so that people who are around them, who love them, who support them, who want to connect and deepen their relationship with, stories and language is a part of that. And I hope that the veterans can gift their family members with an opportunity to witness not just their contribution, but also I don't want to say good side to war, because the war and battles rob of a lot of beautiful things, and war is horrible, but some opportunity for, wow, how did you make it back? Who are the people that showed up for you? And I feel like that's like the ethos and mission statement of your operator syndrome as a whole.
Thank you.
Without further ado, before I roll out the red carpet, Chris, to close out today's, I think, very important topic, and it's not just for the special ops, it's not just for the operators, but I really think that all of us can learn from whole system approach, being more mindful about the fact that our emotions aren't always facts. We can't always believe everything we think. If you were to project a parting message on a massive messaging board, are there any things that you feel like we haven't touched upon today, you feel compelled to share?
Well, and I think that maybe is the closing message, is one of hope. We really have a phenomenal toolkit to help operators, to help responders, to help soldiers. And of course, it includes traditional mental health care of antidepressant medication, psychiatric medications and therapies. But we also have so many other things that we can offer that are more on the physiological side of things. So stellate ganglion block therapy, ketamine infusions, vestibular therapies, transcranial magnetic stimulation, hyperbaric oxygen therapies, functional medicine approaches, and psychedelics. We have so many, and that's just a partial list. So part of what I want to say is don't get stymied by traditional mental health care. There are so many ways to approach and help each and every one of us with our what we call our psychological challenges. And for operators and responders who have this complex set of interrelated injuries and impairments, we have a complex set of solutions and treatments. It's just the challenge is finding them and incorporating them into your lifestyle, into your life. And that includes lifestyle. So we didn't even get into the physiological importance of managing chronic inflammation. But I tell every guy, take turmeric, spend time relaxing, cold plunges, hot saunas, eliminate the McDonald's, eat whole foods, get rid of sugar, get rid of soda, get rid of junk food, snack food, fast food, eat well, dial in your sleep hygiene, and so much good is just going to come from that right then and there. Not to mention that these are all important habits to develop early in a career, early in your life, to maintain your health and your wellness and your functioning. So
I think I think the superpower of humans is our ability to reinvent ourselves. And if we can get a man to a moon, I'm sure we can get to a point of the sustainable way of working on operator syndromes and these complex needs. But seriously, humans are amazing. One of my favorite video series on YouTube growing up was Amazing Humans. Literally, that's what it's called. And just right, the features different amazing human feats. But we humans are seriously amazing. And not just the dark side, but all of our sides. And I hope that this creates some empowering message for those who are seeking help and anything between. Without further ado, Chris, how can people check you out? The medical paper, the book, anything in between?
Easy. So I'm on Instagram. I have a website being redesigned, so it'll be even better in a few weeks. Book is available. Plug for the book. It's available on Amazon. You can buy it direct from the publisher. It's probably in many other places. The medical paper itself you can find it on my website. You can download it. It's a PDF. You can find it on the internet. A lot of the foundations I work for have it posted. Seal Future Foundation, for example, has it posted. If you Google operator syndrome medical paper, it'll come right up.
Well, Chris, I learned a lot today. And as you know, there's 14 different directions this conversation could have gone. If we take away one thing from this book, learn to manage your anger and please get your sleep checked. I think that's probably a win for this conversation. But thank you for your time on a Saturday. Seriously, thank you for what you do, not just a medical paper contribution, but I'm grateful that there are subsets of people like you who are working these very niche topics and niche fields where the public doesn't always have the knowledge of. So thank you for what you do and thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me, Benoit. Enjoyed our conversation.
And as always, I'll link all of Chris's information in the show notes below. And seriously, I hope you work on your sleep today. If that's one thing you can work on today, please work on your sleep. Get anywhere between 7 to 9 hours of sleep. And I'm sure you'll feel better than yesterday if you didn't get that. I'll link all of his information. And I want to encourage you to choose curiosity over fear. And if you feel inspired and you discover more something useful about topical expertise in your life, please share this episode with one friend. Why don't you brighten their day by teaching them something new from this conversation? And as always, I hope to see you in the next week's training of Discover More. And I encourage you to choose curiosity over fear. Until then, see you next time. Thank you for tuning in.